Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth session on the Transboundary Water Series, hosted by the Women in Law Initiative in Pakistan and curated by me. Once again, thank you, Nida, for providing us a platform to have these conversations that are so critical in the current geopolitical landscape, particularly when we're talking about transboundary waters, human rights, and armed conflict. Our session today is titled Water Security in Times of Armed Conflict. It is now a recognized fact that water is indispensable to life, human dignity, and sustainable development. Yet, in times of armed conflict, it is often among the first resources to come under threat. Damage to water infrastructure, contamination of fresh water sources, and disruption of water supply can have devastating consequences on civilian populations, which extend far beyond the immediate effect of hostilities that have originally been studied and talked about. The issue is that international law does provide a range of legal frameworks aimed at protecting both people and water resources upon which they depend during armed conflict. International humanitarian law regulates the conduct of hostilities and affords special protection to water infrastructure and objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. At the same time, international human rights law, including the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, continues to inform the protection of individuals during armed conflict. Building onto that, today's discussion will explore these complementary dimensions of international water law. We will examine how the law protects individuals' access to water during armed conflict, while at the same time also protecting water infrastructure and resources. Our speakers for the session today include Dr. Saadia Zahoor and Mr. Muhammad Oves Anwar. Just a quick introduction. Dr. Saadia Zahoor is a lawyer specializing in public international law and currently works on issues at the intersection of national security and international law. She previously served as a legal consultant with the ICRC, where she worked on issues relating to international humanitarian law. She has also held positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Bahria University. Dr. Zahoor holds an LLB honors and LLM in international law and a PhD in law from the International Islamic University, Islamabad. She has completed a diploma in investor state arbitration from the American University, Washington College of Law, and attended the Center for Studies and Research at the Hague Academy of International Law. She was a Jinnah postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics and is a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Her research has been published in journal articles and book chapters on public international law, including international humanitarian law, international inspections, and aviation and space law. Thank you, Dr. Saadia, for joining us today. Our second speaker for today is Mr. Oves Anwar. Mr. Oves Anwar is Director of Research at the Research Society of International Law. He was the founding director of RSIL's Conflict Law Center. Mr. Anwar's research has informed the drafting of several federal and provincial statutes, including amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act 1997, the Investigation for Fair Trial Act 2013, and the KP Probation and Parole Act 2021. Since 2020, he has served on the Prime Minister's Working Group on International Investment Agreements, as well as the National Security Division's Working Group on Experts in Public International Law. Mr. Anwar is an Eisenhower Global Fellow and holds an LLB honors from the University of London, an LLM with distinction from the School of Oriental and African Studies, an LLM in International Legal Studies from the University of Vienna, and a diploma in International Nuclear Law from the International School of Nuclear Law. Thank you, Wes, for taking our time and joining us for this session. With that, we're going to delve right into it and start with Dr. Saadia. Dr. Saadia, we'll talk a bit about the international humanitarian law aspects of water governance and how it impacts that. So in recent years, water has increasingly become more than a resource affected by conflict. It has become a strategic tool within conflict itself, what we call water weaponization. So my first question to you would be like, why is water increasingly being weaponized in modern armed conflict?
Thank you, Maham, for having me. Maham, I think obviously water came into limelight after probably Gaza and Ukraine war, but it was always weaponized in armed conflict. We have examples of 16th century and 17th century and a modern European history where water was attacked and weaponized because and even in Chinese history we have seen how water was constantly attacked, and the reason is. Um, and today more than ever it's the connection between water and other rights and other infrastructure. For example, even in back in second during second world war when Germany was fighting the war, some of this hydroelectric dams were attacked at that time, and as a result livestock was damaged, human approximately 1,300 people died. Uh, Thousands of acres of land was destroyed. Agriculture produce was destroyed, but approximately 3,000 or something. Um, Sorry, 125 factories were also destroyed. So that's the reason why water has been constantly weaponized during armed conflict, because when you destroy water resources, water infrastructure, it can cascade into destroying other infrastructure. It can it is a source of it's a tool of a collective punishment also, because when you destroy infrastructure and sort of you stop a civilian population from enjoying water, but essentially you are stopping them from enjoying all other rights, because it is essential not only for the livelihood and lives of people, but also for it can shortage or any sort of attack on the infrastructure can and then destroy agriculture, and then can create food insecurity. So that effect that water can have on other infrastructure and other rights is essentially the reason why not only in modern conflicts but in ancient conflict also, people were always try either to control water and then force civilians to sort of either force their leaders to accept the conditions, or to leave that particular space for enemy soldiers and forces to capture the land. So it was and it is, and I think it will remain. And we are seeing more and more countries using it as a tool to coerce other enemies or people, other countries. So yes. Now we have bigger infrastructure, water infrastructure. We have bigger dams. It can create more damages, and we have more actors in the conflict. We have armed groups who have the capability and ability not only to physically destroy water infrastructure, but through cyber attacks and can manipulate the variation. And then we have um, electricity infrastructure directly linked with water infrastructure that can actually sort of not only destroy water infrastructure, but ability of the enemy to fight, because without electricity a lot of sort of fighting ability is also destroyed. So I think that's the reason that it has been increasingly used as a tool in a modern conflict, but I think it's nothing new. It has always been that way.
Thank you, Dr. Sadia. And I do agree. I think, but recently the current conflicts have pushed this more to the front with people talking about it, but it has historically been a very common use in warfare. So, building onto that, given the devastating humanitarian consequences that can result from attacks on water resources and infrastructure, international law has sought to establish safeguards to protect them during times of armed conflict. A simple question would be like, how does IHL protect water and water infrastructure during armed conflict, particularly the physical infrastructure that is on ground?
So IHL has a general protection. It gives a general protection to water and water infrastructure. And when we say water infrastructure, I include power infrastructure, hydroelectric structure in that, dams and dikes, and but so general protection is with the principle of distinction, because IHL's sort of the three basic principle, and one of them is distinction, and it calls for distinction between civilian and military infrastructure. infrastructure, and obviously water and water infrastructure is primarily a civilian infrastructure until unless used purely for military purposes. Now, soldiers taking water out for consumption from a dam or a water reservoir is not military I don't know, activity that makes it renders it protectionless. So that's the fundamental principle of IHL. That's a distinction that protects water and water infrastructure. Then comes the protection of environment, because when you destroy water, it is included in most of the commentaries you will find it is part of the environment. So that's a general protection given to environment. States and state parties are and under customary international law also, armed groups are and state parties, states and armed groups are under obligation not to destroy environment, especially if they know that their acts will destroy environment permanently or for the longer time. And then after the natural environment, then the third protection come in the form of dangerous, um, dangerous forces. Under Arctic Additional Protocol 1, there is a provision which calls for that infrastructure or entities or work installation which contain dangerous forces like dams should not be attacked. So much so that if there is a genuine military target within the nearby, such installation should not be attacked. So that's the third sort of protection that water and water infrastructure enjoys. So the question really is water directly and specifically protected under Geneva Conventions and IHL? Yes. There is another provision which is in Hague Conventions, not reproduced as it is in Geneva Convention, which is about that poison and poisonous weapons should not be used. So that the commentaries include that, poisoning water or water reservoirs is also prohibited under that provision. Now, then there is another provision, Additional Protocol 1, which prohibits attacking dam and dikes because they can create they can release forces which can destroy everything, especially downstream. And that's a specific mention of dam and dikes in Geneva Conventions. And then the starvation, because when you destroy dams, especially intentionally, you are actually trying to create a food and water crisis, which is important for the livelihood of people. So you are actually trying, and then there are countries who are and armed groups who are specifically saying that we want to achieve, we want to starve a certain nation, a certain group of people. Then that's also prohibited. But even if they are not saying it, but the impact is that, or they can. And they can foresee that their acts can lead to starvation, then that's also prohibited. So these are the certain provisions, mostly in Additional Protocol 1. Though the Additional Protocol 1 deals with international armed conflict, but they are part of customary international law, and they are applicable in non international armed conflict as well. And then there is a there are other conventions, for example, Berlin Rules, and Hague Conventions, which also have provisions specifically uh, protecting water and water reservoirs and infrastructure during armed conflicts. Obviously, because we talk about Geneva Conventions because they specifically deal with armed conflicts, but customary international law, for example, Berlin Rules, they all form, and Hague Conventions. Now we say that we can conclude that they are part of the customary international law, and they prohibit attacks on water. And water infrastructure. Lastly, anything which is important for the survival of civilians, you cannot attack that. And obviously, water and water infrastructure is part of that. That's also part of customary international law. Also, Additional Protocol 1. Countries like Pakistan is also not a signatory to Additional Protocol 1, but it has a customary international law status, hence applicable on all countries, regardless if somebody is signatory or not. So these are some of the provisions which protect civilian infrastructure than especially specifically water infrastructure, or things indispensable for the survival of civilians. So these are the, if I'm not missing anything, these are the general provisions which protect water and water infrastructure during armed conflicts.
Thank you for that, because a couple of people who registered for this also have asked us to particularly ask this question, and it was very helpful. Dr. Sadia, building on to that, okay, we've understood that water and water infrastructure is protected during armed conflict, but the reality of modern warfare often like raises difficult questions about like, say, dual use facilities and military necessity. So, building onto that, when can water infrastructure lawfully become a military objective? And what limits does IHL impose then?
First thing is the military objective is described again in International Protocol 1. I think we have to understand that, sorry, just been in a, maybe it's helpful to for some of uh, listeners. Um, Additional Protocols 1 were a product of post Second World War. In fact, the most of the codification process happened during the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, and by that time, water was attacked by different countries, and infrastructure related to water was built around the world, and then there was a fear that enemy can attack them, and it can destroy not only the water infrastructure but the radio infrastructure, and hence there was and then there were a lot of things which were not explained in Geneva Convention, and the need was felt that we need more explanation, we need more details, and hence additional protocol 1 was made, which were in a lot of Muslim countries, Egypt, Pakistan, Syria, at that time have contributed immensely in the drafting of these conventions. Going back, because the principle of distinction and what is a military objective, these things were not discussed in Geneva Convention, and hence Additional Protocol 1 has this Article 52. Which describe what military objective is. So there are three things, basically two things which is important. The first is that either by the nature, location, purpose, or use, um, 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 the object, first it has to be one of these four things, that it either because of its purpose or use or location they are military objective. And the second thing is that attacking, they are contributing effectively into the military purposes, or military of the enemy. So for example, there is something which is used by military forces, but it will not achieve, it is not contributing much into the enemy's sort of operation, then it's not a military target, right? And then if there is no other way, that's the third point. If there is no other way of sort of undoing the damage done by that objective, or to neutralize that objective, only then it can become a legitimate target. So three things, right? But regardless of something is a military target or not, you have to be careful of the principle of proportionality and precaution and distinction again. So even so what I'm saying is, for example, let's say a dam is used for military purposes, or there is an imperative military necessity, that there is no other way of neutralizing enemy except attacking water infrastructure. But even then you have to make sure that it will not cause damage excess to the military advantage that you will gain from it. So whether it is being used for military purposes, secondly there is no other way of neutralizing the threat, and the third is uh, uh, what will be the damage to other infrastructure, what will be in comparison to the advantage that you are getting. So yes, IHL has this exception where there is imperative military necessity, where the civilian infrastructure including dams and water infrastructure is excessively being used for military objective. Now the question is, what could be different sort of situations where water or water infrastructure is being used for um, military purposes. The point is that, as I said in the beginning, that consumption of water for the purpose, water, taking the water out of for the consumption, is not military objective. So you have to prove that either the infrastructure, the water, is let's say giving protection to enemy, or the enemy forces are placed within the, let's say, powerhouse within the dam infrastructure, um, or the combatants are hiding there, or some sort of weapons are being hidden there, or it's been used to launch attacks. In that purposes, because of the location or because of its use, they become military. Otherwise, just because it's giving water, or you know there is exceedingly a concept of mini grids, so that you can divide the grids that providing energy to civilians and militaries. But to be honest, for countries like developing countries, underdeveloped countries, these things, these are luxuries that they cannot afford. I mean, a lot of countries have one major power station, one major transmission line, giving energy to all sort of people, civilian and military. Um, as much as the world is going mad about violating all the principles of international law, I think there are very, very few exceptions where you can say that water or water infrastructure has been used for military purposes. It can't, and and also the standards are really high. Just because you have see, for example, all military infrastructure in Pakistan has presence of some sort of military people or security people, that will not deprive it of protection that it enjoys under IHL. So yeah, there are exception, and the threshold is really high. But if all these conditions are fulfilled, then water infrastructure could be attacked. But it has to has genuine link with military purposes. I hope I answered. I hope this was a question.
Yes, yes. This was, and it's become very clear because a lot of times, particularly in the recent conflict, we've seen arguments being floated around that, oh, this is allowed because it falls within the exceptions given under international law. So coming on to recent conflicts, recent conflicts have highlighted situations in which water is not merely a casualty of war, but is deliberately being manipulated to exert pressure on governments and civilian population. So my question to that is, because we've seen a lot of it in recent years, does existing international law adequately address the weaponization of water? Coming back to our first question, or particularly when water is used as a tool of oppression or deliberately withheld or manipulated to starve a community or an entire population to exert like political pressure. So I know this is going to be an ILIR question kind of a thing because it intersects with international relations as well. But what protections are there to stop the weaponization of water?
Well, to be honest, weaponization of anything, or to actual weapons, acquiring them, making them, and using them, people have to respect international law. States have to respect international law. That's fundamental. But see, the wars have objectives, and the objective always was to weaken your enemy. But over the period of time, we have seen that the objective now is to weaken the civilian population, to pressurize them into, weaken them and forcing them to leave, forcing them to, give up. And that's we have seen in the recent conflicts from Gaza to Ukraine. And especially this happens when there is a protracted conflict. Where supply chains are broken, there's siege or blockades where water and other food supplies are difficult to, humanitarian relief is difficult to be provided to victims of war. But I think otherwise there is enough protection. But there is one thing that is problematic in or is deficient in the current international humanitarian law, which is the starvation standards. See, starvation as a tool of war is prohibited, and all of these things also amount to war crimes. The Rome Statute, and there is accountability for that. But the standard of starvation is really high. So, for example, if one country is using water, and sort of, let's say, there is a deviation in flows, or there is actual stoppage of water, diversion of water, the starvation will not achieve immediately, right? Because, for example, the food supply chain, the crop cycle is not a product of a day or two. A lot of countries have backup food supplies for years, a couple of years in some cases. So just because somebody has stopped the water supply doesn't, and some countries have good water storage also. So for example, I know there's this dam in Balochistan, which is filled mostly with the rainwater, and it can be used for 2 to 3 years, for domestic households usage. So the point is that if somebody is diverting water or stop water from flowing into a particular river, a particular dam might be able to provide for water supply for so let's say a couple of years, right? So the starvation will not be achieved in next 2 3 years because there is enough food supply and the water supply. Although the other country has already weaponized and water and diverted it, or whatever they can to stop it, the flows. And that standard is really difficult to achieve. And then you have to prove that this starvation is achieved because of these actions, right? Because let's say there are climate change impact, there is misuse of resources, which has led to food crisis or water crisis. So I think the starvation standard is really high. It might not be achieved even when the water is weaponized by the adversary, and those standards, even for Rome statutes, are too high. For Rome statute, I mean, all the standards are really high. But as much as the environment, ICC prosecutor has explained that damage to environment, including the water and water resources, amount to genocide, even crime against humanity and war crime in certain cases. I think the starvation standard is really high, and I think that is something that can be used, especially if you want to stop the weaponization of water, which we seeing exceedingly in this country. So that's my understanding of the flaws that we have currently under international humanitarian law.
Thank you. And that kind is a very good segue into stuff that Oves is going to talk about. So, Oves, we're going to now move on to you. Dr. Saadia just explained how international humanitarian law seeks to limit damage to water infrastructure during armed conflict. Building on that discussion from a rights based perspective, and particularly an international human rights law perspective, the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation has become firmly established in international human rights law. There's a General Assembly resolution, there's comment number 15. So, how does this right continue to operate during armed conflict? Because there's been a lot of confusion about that. And what obligations does it impose on states and other parties to a conflict in ensuring that civilians retain access to water?
Maham, thank you again for having me. And no, I'm grateful to Dr. Sadhi for having explained the framework so well. IHL, Dr. Sadhi has gone into, a lot of detail on how it protects, water infrastructure, water, and civilians. From a human rights perspective, I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of the particular general comments and the ISSR or, any of that, we need to understand something conceptually. And that is that international humanitarian law and human rights law emanate from the same objective or the same purpose, which is the protection of human dignity, right? So if there is one stream, and pardon the pun in this particular context, but if there's one stream from which we get all of this, it is, human dignity and the protection of human dignity. And this is something that, the ICTY in Prosecutor versus Frunzija, 1998, said that the entire corpus of international law, not just IHL and IHRL, is really the protection of human dignity. And so if we take that as the aim, then these just become mirroring frameworks. And, we're very clear on the fact that the law that applies in war is IHL. And so that becomes the overarching framework in that thing. But does it displace human rights law? No. This, again, the ICJ, in a number of cases, whether it's the nuclear weapons advisory opinion, the wall advisory opinion, or in Congo versus Uganda, has been reiterated that human rights don't just switch off. and there's not a switch that you turn human rights off and IHL on. Um, so it's really a sliding scale, and it depends on the situation on the ground. And human rights will always remain in the background, supporting the core element, which is protecting human dignity. Now, if we understand that, we can understand, the specific aspects of how both of these frameworks apply. So, number one, does the right to water survive a war? Yes, it does. Access to safe drinking water and sanitation is a recognized human right. It is protected by IHL, as much as it is protected by, say, the ICESR or the General Comment 15, where they actually recognize, sanitation and drinking water and all of these things as protected rights. Um, what we also see is that, uh, as Dr. Saadia mentioned, wartime rules, they already protect water in a very significant way. You can't attack, destroy, or disable drinking water installations, supplies, or irrigation works. And we have this in additional Protocol 1, but also customary international law. Now, but human rights, I think they add a little bit to this. They add in the sense that they enhance really the character of these protections, where they say it's not just about not attacking and refraining from doing something, but it's actually a proactive right, a proactive obligation really on the controlling power. And so you actually have an obligation to keep the taps running when you're in control of certain territory. And this is especially so when you've occupied territory, right? Where you are now the new sovereign, where you are now under an obligation really to provide the protections and the rights and to maintain that human dignity of the population there. So I think a lot of those issues are there. So keeping the taps running is important. What that does is essentially it imposes an obligation on states and on armed groups to not to harm water systems, much like IHL, stop others from harming them, right? So there's an obligation, standing obligation really there, and actively try to restore and maintain supplies. And what is maintain supplies? Like we understand that, water systems isn't just letting a river flow. These could be complex systems like running dams and having pumping stations. And you need specialists and experts and people who are employed by, the previous sovereign to keep them running. So protecting them, because one, they already enjoy protected status being civilians. But I would suggest that because they have such an obligation and that they have, it is their role that allows the enjoyment of the right of water, that they have perhaps an enhanced duty on a state to protect their lives and their ability to be able to continue to function. So I think those are a number of factors there. Um, Another issue is, do human rights extend beyond your borders, right? Because that is also something that we see, especially in times of war. And I think that is certainly clear by, we can discuss this later on, but that's certainly clear by the international jurisprudence as well, that when it comes to water, especially, it is not just limited in the sense that to the end of your border, you have to protect it beyond that as well. So especially in an occupation situation there.
Thank you, Wes. And yes, the extraterritorial application of the human right to water has come under a lot of debate right now because, particularly in a transboundary context, which I find very, very interesting. But and yet we will definitely come back to that in the end again. Another question that I did have, and building on to what you've said about the right to dignity being firmly established, but from a transboundary perspective, what additional challenges arise in protecting people's access to water in a shared basin? Because we know that there are a number of shared basins throughout the world. And how should states balance the protection of this right with their own sovereign interest, particularly in issues with the extraterritorial application of human rights? In this context, it will be the right to water and sanitation.
Um, Maham, again, thank you for that question. So this is, the second you bring in other jurisdictions or it becomes a transnational issue, obviously there are going to be complications. And the reason is the way that international law or law generally is structured, right? You pick up any law in Pakistan and, it says that it is applicable in the territory of Pakistan. laws follow borders, and that's how they're applied. And the legal obligation or the international law obligation on a state is to the extent of generally their borders, right? So if Pakistan is under an obligation to abide by international law, it is to the extent of its borders. It doesn't have to necessarily apply the international law in Papua New Guinea or in some other place in that sense. But what we also understand is that there are certain types of laws that extend beyond your borders. And human rights law is certainly one of those as well. So one is that law is built around the human construct of national borders. Water doesn't really care about borders, right? You have rivers that go there, you have aquifers that are shared by states, and river basins that, as you mentioned, are safe by are there as well. Um, and then there are a number of issues that come about. So if you are, for example, an upstream power, you can use water as a bargaining chip. And as we've seen, India using the Indus Water Treaty and its role as an upper riparian to Pakistan's detriment, and using it as a bargaining chip. Secondly, what we also see is that harm spreads to countries that are not even involved in fighting at times, right? So if you have a war between two countries, there could be a third party that is deeply affected by um, the damage to infrastructure or the withholding of water or anything along those lines. So especially downstream states that are affected that way. And thirdly, what you have is that war destroys the machinery of cooperation, right? So, if you have established mechanisms like the Indus Water Commissioner mechanism that you have with India, um, a war that's going to go right down the list, and you're going to have missiles flying, and you're going to have, Air Force and jets being shot down. Um, and so the mechanism of dispute resolution really changes. And that becomes, I think, another fundamental issue of how transboundary issues arise. When you can't have the proper mechanisms of joint river commissions or shared measurements or information exchange, which is required under a range of frameworks, and not just the Indus Water Treaty, but looking at the 1997 UN Water Courses Convention, which is really the only real framework that deals with this under international law. And information sharing is critical. Article 31, I believe, deals with that over there. The other issue that you see is that sovereignty. How do you establish sovereignty over these joint or shared water sources? And that becomes another issue. And sovereignty is really, again, another construct that we use to explain the extent of our power, the extent of our governance, our ability to govern, but also the extent to which we offer or protect rights there. So if we can't really establish sovereignty clearly, then even though the way governance is done of water courses or of waterways or of water resources is unclear. So I think that's uh, some of these issues there. One thing that we need to know is the argument that some states try to get away from their obligation on protecting rights. And what we need to understand is that the duty follows the control. So if you have control over water, there's an obligation on you to then protect those who are affected by that control, right? And I think certainly in the case of India right now, I mean, the reason I bring this up is because it is a very pertinent case right in front of our eyes happening as we speak. So um, India has control over water that can impact millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions in Pakistan. And so the human rights obligations that international law imposes extend to the Pakistanis that are affected by that control that India has. Right. So I think these are a number of factors that need to be understood. It's never easy when it comes to transboundary issues, especially when it's water and it's so complicated and there's so much emotion involved there. But these are some of the issues that I think we need to look at in these issues.
Thank you, Oves. And yes, um, I do agree like that the extraterritorial application makes it very, very complicated, but doesn't take away from the duty that, as you said, flows from the control. And just on that particular note, on the duty to protect the civilian population, international human rights law recognizes that the impacts of armed conflict and of water deprivation are often felt disproportionately by vulnerable groups such as women, children, persons with disabilities. And in your view, how do you think that, in addition to the UN Water Courses Convention that you spoke about, specific human rights instruments such as, say, CEDAW and the Convention on the Rights of Child strengthen the protection of these groups against water and, on a broader level, environmentally related harms during the armed conflict? Do you think there are specific protections in the subject matter treaties as well?
Absolutely. So these are, very unique conventions that we have. The Child Rights Convention specifically has a duty on providing clean water to children. CEDAW looks at, rural women and gives them guarantees on certain living conditions. We also have to see that, this is beyond any discussion now or any argument that war, natural disasters, any type of real, catastrophe like that impacts women and impacts children and impacts persons with disabilities far greater than any other group, really. Right? So this is clear cut. And the reason is that these are the same groups that are disenfranchised, whether it's politically, these are the same groups that receive, compromised rights ordinarily under the best of circumstances. So once you put state institutions under stress, the same state institutions that have to provide these rights, whether it's schools or courts or the police or whatever, they are obviously going to suffer even more. And the ones who are empowered, whether that is men of a particular class or race or whatever, they're going to be able to be in a better position to ensure that they get the rights at the expense often at of other groups. Right. So that's number one. Secondly, that's why we have specialized conventions that look at this particular situation and recognize that they are people who are within the national ecosystem that is developed, whether it's legal, political, economic, social. They are at a disadvantage and therefore there needs to be some equalizing mechanism there. And that is why CEDAW recognizes that, women in rural settings who are perhaps the most disadvantaged women, in any context, they deserve an adequate living condition. This is Article 14. And the expert committee has reaffirmed this even in times of conflict and under occupation as well. Right? What I think matters, if we look at it, practically, what does it matter? Um, when 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 you when water resources are affected, that means women and girls often in rural settings have to walk further, right? That means they have to do it at times which are safer, often at night, which means the security and safety situation becomes far more dangerous for them. So they're more, they're out on the road for longer. It's often at night. Their security and safety is at risk. The same situation happens with children as well, where they're the ones who are tasked with having to find them, and children who don't often have somebody to protect them, right? So orphans, children whose parents may have died in the conflict, or children for whom the entire family is now dependent on them to look after them. And we've seen this all around the world, especially in Gaza, most recently, where these things happen. Now, the Child Rights Convention also has an obligation, Article 24, which looks at the provision of clean drinking water to children, and this is an obligation which a child really can't enforce on his own. This has to be provided by the state, right? And similarly, women in rural settings don't have the ability to enforce this. It has to be provided by the state. So the state has to be on a proactive basis looking after these individuals. And the same would apply to persons with disabilities, right? So that's one of the issues. The other is, if we look at wartime situations or disaster situations, the first to die from starvation or from thirst or lack of water are children, right? Their bodies simply can't take the deprivation for as long as, say, adult bodies can. And so there's an additional thing. Secondly, when you don't get clean drinking water, the diseases that you suffer, whether it's diarrhea, cholera, children are the first to die at much faster rates than anyone else. And this has been recognized globally by, these aren't just arguments we're making there. And so I think understanding the particular vulnerability of women, children, persons with disabilities, other minorities, or other groups that could be particularly vulnerable there, I think is the first step in us understanding how water really impacts them. And it's a very practical, on the ground worry that you have. So things like, having to go further to get water, going in more unsafe conditions to get water. The water that you get is unsafe. And so when you feed it to your children, they are getting sick and they are dying. So it becomes a very, difficult to comprehend, but also something fundamental. So the law really transforms into something very practical very quickly when it comes to water and war.
Thank you for that, Wes, because we have seen, particularly in the Gaza context as well, that women and children have suffered way more. And just using that also as an example, my next question would be something that Dr. Saadia about, which was water during armed conflict and as like a political tool. But my question to you is that what do international legal frameworks say about the recent practices that we've seen of the deliberate deprivation of water, where it's not like a secondary thing that happens to a primary action, but the main action is to deprive a population of water. And similarly, from that results starvation, collective punishment, and is also a form of torture. So, what does international law out all these particular forms of punishment during armed conflict that result from the deliberate deprivation of water?
So I think for IHL, Dr. Sadi is the ideal person for that. But just speaking about it from a general perspective and from perhaps a human rights perspective, um, what we're witnessing is really a failure of the international system. And this is not just a failure in terms of we've stopped listening to the rules. It is a failure in the culture that has developed around international law. The entire framework of the Second World War was based on certain sanctities that we afforded certain rules of law, right? And look, all of this is a man-made creation. This isn't something that, there weren't tablets from God that were given there, but they inspired certainly, the creation of much of these laws. But this was man-made, human-made law that was given, afforded a certain sanctity. You did not target civilians, you did not kill women and children, and you did not starve people. And there was a certain protection, a certain thing that, we can have a hierarchy of laws, and at the top, we would keep these things. You don't torture people, you don't do all of those things, right? That sanctity has been eroded over very, very quickly over the last few years, right? At most, you could say after, like in earnest, really after the war on terror, and that's where we started seeing the pillars being undercut and being undermined. And from there, we are now witnessing what we're seeing in Gaza, where in open defiance of all things sacred in international law, we have a Western democracy, apparently the only democracy in the Middle East, that was able to openly and without any shame deprive people of basic food, medicines, and on a daily basis, we are hearing that children are getting amputated without anesthesia. People are dying because of lack of medicines or food or whatever. That meat was not available in Gaza for months on end, right? These are the types of stories that you're hearing, and this is happening in 2026, in 2025, by apparently a Western state. And it matters why a Western democracy does this as opposed to, say, a dictatorship in the East, is because they had, or at least the Western liberal world had tried to portray themselves as the guarantors of international order, right? And so when they did it, they undermined themselves and the entire framework that they had established. And that, I think, became the fundamental reason why this culture has dissolved literally almost overnight. Or at least, in international law terms, overnight is a year or two, right? And so what we've really witnessed is this culture going away and then being replaced by a level of chaos that is really, really damning and dangerous. It's every man or woman for themselves, every state going at it, by themselves. So, how do we get back to any sort of semblance? I think it's very difficult now, frankly speaking. You may never get back to the state that you were at. And not that we were respecting all of IHL and all of human rights before this, but there was still a level of sanctity. There was still some lip service that you could pay to it. Now I think that's gone out of the window. What we really need is a return to building that ecosystem. And that ecosystem is both accountability, but also culture, but also feeling amongst individuals, state functionaries, private citizens, that we need to abide by these obligations, right? That custom, that treaty, that human rights and IHL protections are all there again to protect the individual, and we can't use raison d'etat or reasons of the state to allow the violations that keep on taking place there. So I think that's really the fundamental discussion point there. I'm not going to go on this because this is perhaps too theoretical a point, but this is really the argument that I feel needs to be made there.
And uh, and I completely agree with Oves, because my next question also builds on to your idea, your concept of accountability that you've spoken about, that people, the international community needs to kind of take a step back and reevaluate where we're standing. And on that note, so what role do you think that international organizations play in strengthening compliance with international law, particularly the human right to water? Because I also feel that international organizations need to also really, really step up, particularly in times of armed conflict. What role do you think they can play better? What role do you think they play right now? And what do you think that moving forward their mandates and role needs to be?
Um, so, I think I'm deeply disappointed really in the role that many international organizations, many international leaders of organizations have been playing over the last few years. When it comes to a genocide, there are no two sides. You're either on the side of the genocide committing nation or group, or you're against those who are the victims, or you're on the side of the victims. And we've really tried to see UN diplomats at times play diplomacy here. There is no diplomacy to play. It's very clear cut, right? There are people who are dying on one side, and there are people who are committing those atrocities on the other. So I think there has been a critical failure among certain organizations there. The United Nations is still, there have been entities within the United Nations that have played a very positive role, but it's come at a cost, right? It's come at the US withdrawing funding and the US punishing them for that. We've seen the ICC play, a bold role, but it's come at the cost of sanctions being imposed on ICC judges. Similarly, the ICJ is taking up the genocide case. There have been issues with that as well. And so we're really looking at this overall framework where accountability mechanisms that have existed are failing because of whatever problems they had. But at the same time, nobody's stepping up to really buttress them or support them or come up with a solution to do that. So as you mentioned, what I would like to see ideally in an ideal world is punishments, right? You've never had a punishment for, as far as I recall, and Dr. Saadia can perhaps, you know, uh, give us a better answer on this, but I don't think there's ever been a conviction on starvation internationally. There's never been really a conviction of a Western, leader on this. So this is the time. This is where humanity decides whether they are going to take the side of, a country that is committing genocide, a man who, like Netanyahu, who has openly spoken about these issues and who has supported one of the worst genocides in modern history. He is, the entire framework is there to hold him accountable, but I seriously doubt that there'll be any mechanism there. So the issue is that for one state, if we are willing to sacrifice and really let go of everything that has been sacred to us at the international realm after the Second World War, then this was not a system that was worth protecting in any case. Then it's good that it's going and that we have another mechanism to replace it. At the same time, I would argue that there's a lot to want to protect here, right? This was a mechanism that worked in large part. It at least gave us the language of critique. It gave us the yardstick by which we could measure right from wrong. So the definitions in the Rome Statute, the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Regulations, they allowed us to determine what was right and what was wrong. So I think returning back to that, what international organizations can do is really understand and reinforce this language of critique, be open, be critical in these areas, and try to bring back that sanctity that we always had. Otherwise, it's a free for all. Then we can do away with the UN system, we can do away with the systems that have failed, and then try to come up with another system. But what is that system going to be? Is it going to be one that is inspired by, say, China, because China is now the predominant leader. China has had a much better history in the sense that it hasn't been, invading every country in its vicinity. It has played, a role of cooperation with much of its neighbors, and has generally had that effort. Now, internally, what its human rights issues are, that's up for debate. But this is what the reality is, right? So we came to a point where we had this I would say almost idyllic understanding or theoretical conception of human dignity. It was brought out in treaties and in conventions and in customary international law. The world agreed to it, at least theoretically again, and then now we see it crumble. And that is really what is scary and unfortunate there. But I'm just gonna stop there.
Thank you, Wes. That's a very, very, very bleak picture between you and Dr. Saadia about the landscape that we're operating in right now. I'm going to now open the floor for questions. So if anyone has a question from our audience, you can either put it in the chat box or raise your hand if you want to ask it yourself. And if not, because I do have a question after listening to this, because and both of you can like jump in to answer it. So, like, despite the devastating impact of armed conflict on water security, and we've seen, and the general lay of the land is just so bleak. What gives you, both as international lawyers and as people who have been practicing and working in the field of international law, hope that the international law and international community can better protect this essential resource in the future? Do you feel like there is going to come a point where the international community will have to stand up? And or do you think that it's far gone now, and it's just a reality we're going to learn to live with water scarcity and water deprivation becoming a new normal, as we would call it?
Saadia, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think, Maham, obviously there are moments, especially after like a couple of years back. I personally felt like really I never been this disappointed with the whole international order. But the one thing that gives me hope is history. And as was saying that how things have been unfolding in last like maybe a quarter of century since global war on terror. But there was one thing that was I was thinking at that time was that whatever he was saying was absolutely right. But um, the difference in last 25 years is that things are well documented, maybe televised, maybe live stream sort of way, especially in Gaza. But we have seen, even in our lifetimes, at least I know I am that old, that we have seen two genocides in our lifetime, like in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. So and and it's difficult to say one genocide was worse or better or whatever, less tragic than other. But thousands of people have died. And to be honest, when it comes to water and related infrastructure and the interdependence of other things on and sanitation on and health on water, uh, every country, especially Pakistan, loses more people every year to, unsafe water, then to war and conflict. But going back to genocide and the violations of international law, I think the one thing that is totally different this time around is that now states do not care about their actions. Earlier, even in the war of terror, they were trying to create some sort of excuse for their actions. Right now, as Aves has said, that might is right, is the only thing that, and to be honest, every country is doing it. I don't want to name names, but I think everybody in their capacity is saying, okay, we have this power, we will do this. If we can bomb anybody, we will bomb them. If we can stop water, we can stop water. We can stop food supply or disrupt food supply chain, we will do that. Energy resources. So everybody is doing whatever they can without any respect for rules. And it's a strange way. Every country is saying the other country is violating international law, even today, right? And it's so strange with ICC. I think we have discussed it earlier in some other places. When Ukraine happened, all the European countries, including America, under Biden, supported ICC for issuing, starting investigation into Russian action of Putin, against issuing warrants against Putin. The same sort of people and countries went after ICC for issuing, Netanyahu's and Galant's warrants. So I think history has shown us that, after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, after Yugoslavia, after Rwanda, there was accountability. Not perfect accountability, but there was some sort of accountability, and it has its own problems. So I think, as Avas said, that we want to see more accountability, and to be honest and fair, as somebody working on national security, my constant advice to everybody is be careful. Things might seem different today. They might be very, very different in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years time, because we have seen that even if the ICC fails, there could be tribunals, there could be accountability in different ways. So I think people should be careful whatever they're doing today. So my hope is that people will realize that the only way forward for humanity is to have some sort of international order. It might be different, might be led by some other countries, it might be led by one country or group of countries, but we have seen throughout the history that we go through these phases of total chaos and then come back with some sort of accountability and some sort of semblance of it will never be perfect. It will have privileges for some, it will have cost for some, but I think even with UN, even with I think people are talking, and I think what happened in our own region, where some people were over and above accountability, and suddenly there was a thirst of people saying and asking for justice in some ways. It gives me hope that as much as there is a wild west everywhere, people are still aspiring to have international order, justice, peace, and I think and I am hopeful regardless of whatever is happening around me. Every single thing is saying or giving is sort of signaling to something even bigger and disastrous in coming days. But I think even if that happens, even something bigger, or if one mad country uses a nuclear weapon against another country, I still believe that whoever will survive will have a better world than us. And I hope I'm right. For change, I think I'm not very hopeful person and a very dark person with everything. But I hope that we see a better world in our lifetimes. Otherwise, there's a utter chaos that we're facing, because we have to understand. A lot of people talk about. I know I'm also rambling now, but. A lot of people talk about nuclear weapons and stuff and how this can destroy, but we have to understand now countries have non-nuclear weapons more powerful than weapons that were used, bombs that were dropped at Hiroshima, Nagasaki. So if we will not sort of recalibrate and rethink the international order, there is only destruction and darkness. And I know that humanity and collective human consciousness is still at the place where we will only we will struggle, but we will go for a better future, inshallah. So I'm hopeful.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Oves?
Yeah, I mean, I agree very much with what Dr.
After
Sadia
you,
said.
Saadia.
Sorry. Um, should I go ahead?
Yes, yes. Sorry.
Okay, so I very much agree with what Dr. Sadia said. I don't immediately have the most positive um, outlook on this, but the things that have given me hope have been things like the election of Mayor Mamdani, for example, right? Now, New York is home to the largest Jewish population outside of Israel, right? And the Jewish community voted very much in favor of Mayor Mamdani. In fact, they did a recent poll, and Mamdani, who is very critical of Netanyahu's war, is a lot more popular amongst Jewish voters than Netanyahu was, right? And so I think the first step in recognizing a lot of what has been done is that one, the Jewish community is saying that this is not in our name, this genocide that is being committed, we distance ourselves from it. It is not. Secondly, the attempt to conflate Israel with Judaism uh, or Zionism with Judaism, that again is something that is an anti-Semitic thing because you are trying to, literally one extreme right-wing government, their actions you're trying to conflate with the religious group or the community, ethnic community that is the Jewish people. So I think that is something that is very hopeful. What I also see is, the in Europe and in other countries, the turning away and really losing. Um, what is it, the fascination that many of these countries had with Israel, and Israel having used most of its whatever victim card or whatever it had post Second World War, that is now not making the same type of impact that it used to have. And I think they are desperate in the way that they portray, the arguments at least that they're trying to build for, to get, Western sympathies behind the state of Israel. So I think those are some of the positive here. Secondly, we also see movements all around us, right? These are domestic movements. It's domestic politics that changes, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's India with the cockroach Janata Party, and whether it is Nepal or many of these countries, we are seeing people standing up for the right causes, and we're seeing people having been fed up of really the old system. We saw this in the Arab Spring. That wasn't the outcomes were then manipulated and twisted there, but we're seeing some positive outcomes here in our region, and I hope that that can sustain itself. Bangladesh is a very positive example, I would say, in that regard, with a transition to a democratic system that was very beneficial for I think the people of the country. It was a new start in that regard. So that is where the hope lies, and it's hopefully these types of movements that bring us back to our center of gravity, which is sanctity for international law.
Thank you, Dr. Saadia and Oves, for that, for giving people some hope that there is something we can fall back on. Nida had a question. Nida, you can
Thank you so
unmute yourself.
much, Maham. So, Wes, I was very interested in what you were saying that, there's a way that we'll need to sort of rebuild the sanctity for the international order in one way or another because people are losing that sanctity. And that's why we're seeing the states being emboldened with their human rights violations. And we see some of the spillover effects of that domestically as well. So it's not just within the international arena, but we see that human rights are dwindling within states as well. But at the same time, we have things like the GSP plus status through the EU mechanism. And I was just wondering if you think that those economic sort of measures, which of course also have a force of law at some level, do you think that could be a way through which, so we can get states to respect human rights again? Because in the past also FATF and all of these mechanisms or where benefits like economic benefits are attached to these human rights commitments, we've seen states, sort of comply more with all of these requirements. So can that channel be tapped to get at least some states, not all states, but the ones that are at least dependent on this kind of funding or this kind of access to European markets, do you think that could be a tool? So that's question number one. I have other questions, but I'll just sort of stop here, let you answer, and then maybe take the conversation forward from there. Thank you so much, Maham, for letting me ask that question.
Thank you, Nita. That's a great question. So I think on rebuilding sanctity, that's a whole other thing we can go there. But looking specifically at GSP plus and whether we can force countries or arm twist them into abiding by international law, I think that is a different thing. Um, you know, the EU GSP plus mechanism has been great for our economy. It's been very beneficial in that way. I would even say on the human rights front, it has imposed certain pressures on the government of Pakistan to take measures, which, from a human rights perspective is positive. But is the government of Pakistan's heart in it? Or are we simply doing whatever we're doing to abide by these international commitments? And what this does is that it replaces the obligation to our people with the obligation to the European Union, right? And that is what my concern is. You can't arm twist people into wanting to be just. You can't arm twist governments into changing the flavor of their governance model. See? And if EUGSP Plus was so perfect, we wouldn't have many of the political or justice or judicial related problems that we're facing today, right? And if it was such a effective mechanism, the least that they could do was, cut it off when things are looking going downwards, right? We're not seeing that. What we're seeing is really political decisions taking place. And I'm not just talking about the Pakistani context, I'm talking about globally, right? Politics will always, unfortunately, be a higher priority and will always take precedence rather than the individual rights of another people in another country. Right. And so we need to be, I think, a little careful and a little critical of schemes like this. As somebody who works in the human rights domain, has it been beneficial on the ground? Definitely. EU GSP Plus has, you could say that there are direct things that the government of Pakistan has done. But at the same time, I think many of those things, at least over the past 5 years or so, have been more, how does one put it delicately, more checkbox ticking rather than really going into the meat of it and trying to find solutions to the problems that Pakistanis in our context, in villages, in Sindh, in KP, in Balochistan are actually facing. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, that these efforts have to be autonomous, indigenous, and solution oriented for us, right? Not transplants and not outside obligation. And this is a realization that the state has. It's not something that just comes about like that. This is a movement. This is what the people have to start demanding. So again, sorry for the pessimism there.
Dr. Saadia, do you have something to add to that?
I think obviously I agree with Oves. There's one thing that I obviously this is me saying in my personal capacity. You have to understand that a lot of things that GSP and other things, other schemes, as Oves said in this regard, their intention is also not to. They don't care about our human rights, essentially. And we also don't care about our human rights or human rights of our people. I tell you why I'm saying this. See, they have their own idea of human rights, which not necessarily go well with our society as well, right? This is a predominantly a Muslim society. We have been studying the new mechanism that can be implemented. For example, Rome Statute. The new GSP can ask you to make it, sort of fundamentally that you have to sign or become party to the Rome Statute. Thank God for Trump, but in this case at least. But all I'm saying is that you have to understand that sometimes these things are threat to your national security. Sometimes these things don't go well with the religious beliefs of the majority of the people of this country. And it has created a lot of problems, a lot of pressure for government. And I know that there is a lot of financial benefit attached to this. I'm not sure whether those financial benefits are for the poor people or for certain class of people. But obviously, there's a trickle down effect or whatever. But that's at least what we believe in. But all I'm saying is that I think we have spent a lot of money and time and energy and man hours to sort of tick box those things. But all I'm saying is that there might be some benefits. Other countries have, like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, have tried to use this as an opportunity to evolve and get out of the poverty index. And to be honest, for the when the first for the first time I read the criteria for countries who get this, and actually I felt sad for a long time, because it is about so the countries who are abjectly poor, get these concessions. So I think there is, for me, somebody who has worked and tried to work around it. I don't see any benefit. The human rights and the demands have to come from people, the countries where human rights are applicable, or are given to people. The movements, that pressure comes from the citizens, not from outside. And we have to understand that there is a lot of resentment in a lot of countries, where they think that these Western ideas, or the ideas which are being imposed on them. So, the point is that there might be some benefit. There's economic benefit. There might be some development with regard to how the human rights are implemented and given to people. But all I'm saying is that there are too many dark sides to these things. A lot of those dark things might not be in public domain, but can be sucked up by fear that the next steps can create a lot of problem for the state of Pakistan and for people also.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Maham, there was one thing that when I should have mentioned it earlier. If somebody has a question, obviously we can answer that. But I think we have time. There's one thing which is important for protection of and which is the requirement of IHL. Over the years, I have realized when we teach IHL, when we discuss IHL, we always talk about what are the responsibility of attackers, that they have to make distinction, they have to make sure that they're taking the precautions and use the right amount of force. But with certain military objectives, it is also the responsibility of defenders. So for example, the water infrastructure, or for that matter any civilian object, the defenders should make sure that they don't sort of use civilian objects to protect military objects. So, for example, there is no need for military to station themselves in, let's say, schools, dams, powerhouses. So, it is also the responsibility of defenders to not sort of induce, I don't know the right word, but sort of attract unnecessary attention from your enemy. And so that responsibility is also with defenders. And a lot of time when we discuss IHL, we talk about what is the responsibility. And why I'm saying this, this should be part of our um, development structure. This should be part of our infrastructure, where we should take care that the military infrastructure stays away from civilian infrastructure. This might not be possible when the cities are already developed, when this infrastructure is already developed. But when you are designing, when you're planning, when you're thinking of new projects, dams, and other civilian and military objects, I think that's something that people should be careful while they're creating infrastructure. And civilian infrastructure should never be used for military purposes, because once you use it for whatever reasons, then that attracts attacks. And there is always, for example, in our own region, we have seen America attacking Iranian schools, other countries attacking hospitals, and other correction facilities. But the point is, the question is whether the defenders were using those facilities for military purposes, which have attracted those things. And I'm not passing any judgment on anything. I'm just making a general point that we should discuss civilian objects, military objects, with also with the what is the duty of the defenders in terms of making sure the distinction is there. I hope.
And thank you, both of you. From this got from the national security perspective, Dr. Saadia, we have another question. And so we're going to start with you, and then Oves is going to get a jab at it as well. So a term that's been floating around is escalate to de-escalate, which basically is that states can take escalating measures or retaliatory measures to counter, say, things like suspension of treaties, like water treaties, right? So, for instance, like Pakistan has closed airspace for India, and if so, how effective are these extra, like what we say in international law, these countermeasures with regards to issues that hedge on water security? So, both from a humanitarian law perspective, a human rights law perspective, and politically, because we've seen in a number of international law forums, like and international relations forum, like this term saying that it's okay to escalate to then de-escalate.
Really, I hate this term. And I work very hard to keep myself a humanitarian rather than those national security expert sort of thing, whatever, even if that exists. But the point is that I think escalation is always escalation. Uh, uh, you know, um, offensive defense and whatever these things are. These are the mumbo jumbo, the language that you're being used to justify the actions. The point is, um, aggression is prohibited in international law. The wars are only allowed when they're defensive wars to protect people. And I do understand, and I think more than normal people, that sometimes our international law um, teachings and learnings, I have to undo those when we're talking about policy. But uh, but the more I work, more I compromise on those in those moments, I realize that the if we genuinely want peace in this world, if we genuinely want people to progress and have a peaceful, sustainable development and rights for everybody, then we have to stick to the basic principle of international, where the prohibition to use force should be upheld, right? Um, with regard to countermeasures, I think the airspace thing and water suspension treaties, India never claimed that they have done under the countermeasures, right? They never said that this is a countermeasure. So until unless they claim this, then we will, sort of. Because countermeasure has certain conditions under international law, and by the way, civilians and civilian objects should not be attacked under reprisal. They are protected. Just because somebody has done something wrong, you cannot go and attack them. Even if they attack your civilians, you cannot attack their civilians or civilian objects. This should be the baseline. And with regard to countermeasures, the conditions that are required, one of which is that do you think that your actions will force the other country to change its course? So does closing airspace has forced India to sort of unabase the undo the abeyance of Indus Waters Treaty? Or if India alleges Pakistan is supporting terrorism, which we are not, but if we are supporting right of self-determination of people of Kashmir, have we undo our support or taken back our support just because India has put the treaty in abeyance illegally and unilaterally? No. So so countermeasures are not something which anybody can do any action and without any consequences. It has to be a temporary measure to achieve something, and nobody's achieving anything. At least if we can be objective about this. Um, so yes, states are sovereign; they can take certain actions, but I don't think so that these actions qualify under countermeasures, and uh, um, and illegal acts, prohibited acts and the use of force are not allowed under countermeasures. So there is a limit to countermeasures. to be honest, I don't believe in these things, so I don't have a better answer, and just to say that we should not indulge in these things. This will not benefit anybody. Pakistan has done the airspace thing. India has done the airspace thing. India will jeopardize the peace of this region, if not the world, if they just try to divert our water, regardless of putting this treaty unilaterally and illegally in abeyance. So, whatever. But for me, these things are um, illegal, violation of international law, and threat to international peace and security. Talk like a national security person rather than an international law person, but
Oves, we have an
Suddenly you become
international.
a proper hawk in these things. But so I have a slightly different view. I mean, I agree with Dr. Sadia very much that I hate the term escalate to de-escalate. Why don't we de-escalate to de-escalate, right? That seems a little more logical. Secondly, escalate to de-escalate is a recipe for a nuclear war, right? One escalates, and the hope is that the other doesn't have the same strategy in mind. कि वो भी escalate करे. When you keep on escalating, you're going to get to a point where, um, you're going to escalate to a point where it's going to get very, very serious, and the consequences are going to be unmanageable then. And you can also get into this spiral where you lose control. Right. And that is something that the further away you are from that, the better it is, especially between two nuclear armed countries. Um, so that's one thing. The second thing is we don't realize there's a term in American military strategy called the enemy gets a vote, right? Escalate to de-escalate is your strategy. You don't know what the enemy's strategy is, right? What if their strategy is double escalate to de-escalate? And so it gets to a point where it becomes absurd almost, right? So that I think is a concern there. Secondly, in our context, and especially in the context of water, what are we escalating towards? One is, India getting back to the Indus Water Treaty, or is it, we escalate to the point where we have to destroy a dam? These are really, really like, this is pretty much the nuclear option, short of the actual nuclear option, right? Hitting a dam is not something, it's a severe taboo under international law. Um, and even if you have the best military justifications for it, it is still a very, very dangerous move to do, right? What you will have is essentially, I mean, say you hit an Indian dam. What happens to your dams now? Can we afford, an $8 or $10 billion dam being destroyed? A dam that is critical to, say, our energy production in Pakistan. You want half the country to have no electricity for the next, say, foreseeable 2, 3 years, because it takes quite a bit of time to build a dam or to repair a dam in that sense. So these are some of the things we need to look at. Of course, if it gets to such a desperate situation where our crop cycles are being affected, where millions of people's lives are being affected, and India becomes so difficult and intransigent, and the international community does nothing to resolve the situation, then if you get to the, then it's not on us. We're trying to protect our people. Then it's really on them. But again, I would be extremely careful. We're talking about hypotheticals at this moment, but I would be extremely careful in employing a strategy of escalating to de-escalate in that particular thing.
what was the part where you don't disagree with me? Because I don't know whether what have I said actually, but this is what I want to say. These things are not helpful. This escalation, de-escalation thing are stupid things. There's no benefit. Nobody's gonna win. And if it comes to that, um, nobody cares about these countermeasures if they are. So this is what was exactly what I was saying. And obviously destroying dams under any condition is prohibited under international law, until unless you can prove that they are they have a military purpose and military objective, and there is no other alternate way to sort of neutralize that threat. So I don't know what came out of my mouth, but this is exactly what I wanted to say, what Avaz
No,
just
no,
said.
no, Dr. Saadia, I wasn't saying, I was just saying to sensationalize the issue, लोग कहेंगे, oh, disagreement किया है इनमें. But actually, there's no disagreement. We're on the same page on this one.
Great. And I do agree with both of you here as well, because as both of you said, the escalation ladder, then there's no end to it, right? You can just keep on adding a step to that. It's not that there's like an escalation ladder that we know that you can't go ahead this, right? We have a question from someone. Khatija, do you want to ask a question?
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Maham, and also thank you, Dr.
Now I
Khadija, we
can't hear
can't
you.
hear you now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Hey. Okay, so my question.
Now we can't hear you.
Oh my God, I don't know what's happening. So sorry.
So these your enemies are trying to hack you.
Yeah,
Okay, can you hear me now though?
we
Yes,
can.
we can.
Okay, thank God. Okay, so my question is that what would have to change in the next decade or so for us to say that water security accountability has actually improved, and like not more like no more norms or institutions, but states actually held responsible.
And again, that's a very good question, and I think both have can give you an answer to that. Since we've been starting with Dr. Saadia for all previous questions, we're going to start with Oves for this month.
I'm very happy with Dr. Sadia starting all the answers.
Okay,
It
perfect.
gives me something to disagree with.
Yeah.
No,
Dr. Saadia, do you want
but
to start?
I think I didn't get the second part of the question, but the first part is what has to change.
So,
Ma'am?
yeah, so the question is that to say that what has to change in the next decade for us to say that water security and accountability has actually improved. That is part one. And what Khadija meant is not more norms or institutions, but what would change in terms of states actually being held
Yeah,
responsible. So improvement and responsibility, two parts to
yeah.
the question.
I think um have been reading a lot what you people have been writing. But obviously this is something that we all are thinking about how to obviously we are obsessed with our own region, but we are seeing the similar problem in other regions with other countries, especially at Nile basin, where countries are actively involved and in sort of conflict. But to be honest, in next 10 years, I see um, more intense competition between countries with regard to water, because we have to understand that all the countries are now investing a lot on data centers, AI, this crypto mining thing, which is highly energy intensive and water intensive. I hope that you people understand. I mean, we all know that we need a lot of water to cool it down, and these are the issues that have been discussed in US, and the water quality has been impacted because of these data centers. And so I think the countries who are relying on transboundary water for most of their industries and domestic use, I think there will be more intense competition. But if one thing has to improve, is to the countries have to understand that, which obviously a lot of countries do believe that they have absolute sovereignty over their water, right? And some of our allies in across the globe also think that they have absolute sovereignty over their water, transboundary water. So I think the one thing that has to change is people have to understand that this is a shared resources. These are limited and shared resources, and this is a fundamental right of the people, and the lives and livelihood of people, the health, economic security, food security depend upon this the water resources, and hence everybody has to share it equitably, share these water resources. Now, this understanding has to come. If you people think that there is no need for more norms or no, more new institutions, I disagree. For sure, um, states are sovereign states, and they opt to follow certain rules and regulation and customary law if they want. But we have seen in certain cases, um, there has to be some binding mechanism. There has to be some accountability. See, India's Waters Treaty was successful because it has a binding dispute settlement mechanism, right? But we have otherwise. One country will, so see, a lot of people always say that we have more rights under customary international law, and I keep saying that, yes, we have more rights under customary international law, but where do we go to enforce them, right? So there has to be some institution, and ideally a global mechanism, a global binding treaty, where all riparian states can have a consensus on water sharing formulas or um, principles. And then there has to be a binding mechanism, dispute settlement mechanism, to enforce those rights. Otherwise, without and by the way, the existing customary international law, the UN Convention, and I know that at least two of you believe that. Me not Oves, but Maham and Khadija both believe that Pakistan should sign and ratify the treaty. But I think these principles have these existing conventions and customary international law does have a lot of problems. And I do think that there is a need for newer rules and binding mechanism, and ideally an international organization to enforce them. It can be done through existing international organizations, but there is no, I don't know the second part of the question, why it has an emphasis of not creating new norms and new institutions. And I'm saying this for a reason. Aves has hinted it during one of his the part of his question answer session, where he said that, oh, what will be the new order? Will it be led by China? But that's the point, because countries like China, India, a lot of global South countries believe that those existing norms are norms. They were created when these countries do not have a more say in the norm making, right? And even countries like Pakistan, we want to have a fairer share in norm making, and we should also advocate for new norms, especially for water sharing, global water sharing principles that all countries agree on. And there is a mechanism, there should be a mechanism, global mechanism. See, we have seen that bilateral treaty was working fine, but then bilateral treaties are dependent on the will of two countries. We need a mechanism, a regional mechanism, a global mechanism. So I'm all for new norms, which is acceptable to all countries. Obviously, everybody has to compromise a bit on their existing positions, and there has to be a mechanism to enforce those principles, and some sort of global guarantees by maybe backed by some institution. So yes, countries have to internalize that they have to share these water resources. If they will not, there will be a and when I say there's a global security, I'm not just saying that nuclear weapons or stuff like that. The global security is threatened when people are hungry. The global security is threatened when when we talk about comprehensive national security, we talk about how disease and migration and these things have an impact on at global level. So yes, the global peace and security will be affected if people are hungry. 250 million people of a country are hungry or thirsty, or going through starvation or anything. So that will have a global impact, right? So yes, countries have to internalize that they have to share water, but there is a genuine need for new norms and new institutions, ideally a binding international treaty. I hope I have answered Khadija's question.
I think you have. Thank you, Oves.
Yeah, so very briefly, just to
You
add a little bit
disagree?
to the no, I don't disagree. मेरी मजाल है मैं disagree
You
करूं.
wouldn't dare. I was going to say that. He wouldn't.
I wholeheartedly agree. Let me start with that. But I just want to say, look, water obligations, water rights are inextricably and extremely closely linked to climate change. And we cannot have a discussion on the future of water if we're not having a very strong discussion on climate change. And so water accountability or water-related accountability is really climate change accountability. If states are not going to take responsibility for the impact that they're having on, increasing temperatures, global temperatures, we simply can't have a debate because in 50 years, the waters that we're talking about won't exist, right? The rivers that we're talking about will be drastically different. And I want you to fully understand this. Like if our Indus River basin dries up, we're talking about impact that 100 nuclear weapons can't do, right? We're talking about population fall. We're talking about uninhabitable regions of Pakistan. Right? If you think that there are deserts in Balochistan, then imagine if more of that is part of that. If we can't grow crops to feed our people, all of these issues are genuinely issues that we're going to face. And the next 10 years are when the decisions have to take place so that 50 years down the road, our people aren't starving or our people aren't thirsty for water. Um, so I think climate security is really the issue there. The second thing I think is also how, I agree with Dr. Saadia that we can't stop making norms. This is a very novel situation, climate change in water, in the sense that we haven't faced this type of thing. So we have to create norms. Otherwise, we don't know what is right and wrong. You can't hold anyone accountable if you don't have a yardstick or some criteria by which you can determine that their actions are correct or their actions are wrong, right? Or states what they're doing. And so creating those norms is the first step in really holding anyone accountable, right? Um, so things like the Rome Statute, more than its ability to ensure that people go to jail or are held accountable, is the standard that it creates of listing out what is a war crime, what is a crime against humanity, what are these internationally recognized crimes. So similarly, I think understanding and creating the norms and institutions that are necessary for that is critical. And another thing is that we need to reconceptualize, the obligations of the state. So, look, there's going to be fundamental changes in how water is used in the future, from drip irrigation to desalination plants, and a lot of innovation is going to have to go into this. Otherwise, we are going to have significant fall in populations. And when I say a fall in population, I mean there are going to be deaths directly related to lack of clean drinking water. And this is going to be a global thing. So we are going to have to focus a lot on this. Wars will, just like we saw in Iran, desalination plants were targeted as a means of coercion, as a weaponization tool there. So those things are going to be there. We're going to have to reconceptualize how the state deals with its people, how the state functions in times of war against, say, an adversary. Can we build the sanctity back in for issues of water because it is so much more significance now than before. And Iran and Gulf countries might be able to afford alternatives for their people. Pakistan cannot. And certainly not at the scale that we're talking about. These Gulf countries, even Iran, don't have populations no anywhere near the size that we do in South Asia. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to leave it at that. I also have to rush, Maham. So if we could maybe allow me to, to leave that. You're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is going to be we're going to wrap up now as well. We just have one question which I think both of you can give like a 30-second response to, and then we'll wrap it up. This is also like a future-looking question, and do you believe that
But
international
Maham,
law
I think it's already been answered with Khatija, so I think it's okay. I've got my answer. If you want to wrap up, you may do that.
Okay, great. Then we're just going to wrap up. If there are any last minute comments that either of the speakers want to make on just like a 30-second wrap up on what you think the future should look like, we can have that and then we can wrap it up. Oves?
Uh,
Dr. Saadia.
I think just what Oves was saying, that we have to rethink the state obligation. I think people across the world also have to rethink their relationship with water. And I know you want a small short answer, but I think this is something that we need to rethink and understand the challenges that we are facing collectively. And I can't agree more with Oves with regard to climate change and its impact on water security. Thank you.
I thought you were going to give a longer answer. You just said, but again,
आपने जाना था.
you know, I'm nonplussed. I've lost my chain of thought now. Again, looking at the future, I think we have some positives to look at. Mechanisms, there are ups and downs in how orders function, and you are humanity has a tendency to come back and coalesce around something that is generally beneficial for most people. And the alternative is might is right, but might is right can't really function in a place where you have to steal other people's water all the time, because the enemy, again, as we mentioned, gets a vote, and often states are vulnerable in other ways than they realize. So I think we're going to have to come back to the drawing board. We're going to have to find solutions that work for everyone, or at least for the majority. If that means greater bloc politics, that is probably the bleaker, the worse situation. But if it means more multilateralism and finding solutions that work for everyone, that would be ideal. But for that to happen, you need to have less Trumps in the world, and you need to have more positive, cooperative leadership that needs to take place, like Dr. Saadia.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Dr. Saadia. This was a very, very interesting session, and we have all learned so much from the two of you. For our listeners, thank you for being here, and please stay tuned for our upcoming sessions in August, which will be announced on the Women in Law initiative page and otherwise as well on LinkedIn. Thank you, both of you, and we look forward to seeing you at our future sessions as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you,
Maham.
Maham. Thank you, Nida.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Nida. Goodbye.
Thank you, Ji. Khuda Hafiz.
Good afternoon.